And we are back. Hello everyone, hello world, hello internet, hello Jason Isaac. We have done preventing the tyranny of the majority. We're now looking at the tyranny of government. Preventing tyranny, a power divided is a power contained. And I've said in the past that there's no real need to memorize a lot of material on this course. However, you could do an awful lot worse, than to learn this little bit off by heart. The accumulation of all powers in the same hands may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny, and that's Madison writing in 1788 in the Federalist Papers. Not part of the Constitution, remember that, the Federalist Papers are not part of the Constitution. In fact, they are a work of propaganda designed to augment or to drive the Founding Fathers towards a certain conclusion, of which, yeah, I'm happy to talk about that some other time. But it's a really nice little way of trying to remember that a power divided is a power contained. And that is at the very heart of the separation of power. The separation is all about the division of power. Checks and balances go alongside that, and federalism is another way. But these are all separate ideas. And then on top of that, of course, you've got rights. Now, just coming back to the separation of powers, this is a question that comes up individually from time to time. And it's worth remembering that what this is about is differentiation, that we divide the power into those three branches, that we have incompatibility, which is there, that says incompatibility, it's perfectly clear. And then finally, legati non legatere posset, as my politics tutor a long time ago said, it's that you can't delegate. Delegates cannot delegate. So in other words, the legislature can't say, you know what, I can't be bothered doing this. Here, executive, you do it for me. So those are the four aspects of the separations of power, the fourth being checks and balances. First, differentiation. Second, incompatibility. In other words, you can't be a member of more than one area. And thirdly, legati non legatere posset. And I do apologize to the Latin scholars out there because I probably just butchered that horribly, but it was in 1988. Delegates cannot delegate, so the Supreme Court can't say, you know what, I'm not going to bother with this, you guys do it. Right, so this is what the Constitution says about containing power. We're going to divide it up. We're going to divide it up between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. We're going to use ambition to counter ambition, that's your checks and balances. Then just for giggles, we're going to divide it at a state level, at a federal level, and then we're going to give everybody rights so you can't trample all over them using the tyranny of the majority or any other mechanism. So, there we go. That is what the Constitution has to say about containing power. Problems. Well, duh. But that was the general idea. This is the whole point. It was not supposed to be easy to govern. The general principle that we have to remember here is that the government that governs best governs least. This is what the Americans wanted to introduce. This is what the Founding Fathers thought about. It shouldn't be easy to govern, excuse me. Government should be bloody difficult. And one of the problems that we've got in the UK is that, you know, if the government wants a law passed, generally speaking, Parliament will pass it, sometimes without even looking at it. The government says jump and Parliament says how high. In the UK, if the government wants legislation to go through, it is very, very unusual that the legislation will not go through. In the United States, if Congress wants the legislation to go through, it is by no means guaranteed to go through. If the president wants legislation to go through, you want it when? It's just not going to happen. So, this was the general idea. So the federal government in particular was designed not to work easily. And the real reason for that was A, to prevent tyranny, and B, because, you know, it's the states that were supposed to be doing the job. The federal government is supposed to have a very, very limited role in this whole shebang. And the big problem we've got when we were looking at federalism earlier is that it's so difficult for the federal government to do its job because of all of this. That was the idea, but now expectations of the federal government have changed. Expectations of the president have changed, expectations of Congress have changed, but the Constitution hasn't changed, and so it's very, very hard for anybody to get anything done. Gridlock. The problem being, right now, gridlock is not really what is required. So, as I said earlier, we've got a vastly expanded role of the federal government, largely because of our three types of crises, those being war, financial Armageddon, and civil rights. We've got vastly expanded expectations, in particular of the president. The president has to promise the sun, the moon and the stars to win his election, but then when he gets into office, he can't even order a pizza. Now, that reminds me, if you haven't been watching the Obama documentary on BBC, watch it, download it before it drops off the iPlayer. It is extraordinary. It's so good. The level of access there is really quite extraordinary. That's inside the Obama White House. I'll include a link at the end of this particular presentation. Watch it. It is just fantastic. One of the constant refrains throughout that is that the president has nominally all this power, but in reality, can he even order a pizza? So we have vastly expanded expectations of the president, and then there's this ongoing demand for Congress to present legislation. But Congress can't legislate at the best of times, and it certainly finds it very, very difficult to legislate now when we've got the internal divisions, when we've got Congress itself utterly fragmented and an utter shambles. The problems that we've got then, party polarization. Now this makes Congress very, very difficult to work, and it also makes things very, very difficult for the president. So party polarization doesn't help. Now this has got nothing to do with the Constitution. That's not the Constitution's fault, except insofar as it tees it up and it doesn't have any provision for this. But how on earth could they possibly have foreseen the ongoing trial by media that is driving the party polarization? MSNBC versus Fox. I mean, one would expect to take fire from the enemy, but when you're encountering friendly fire for being too moderate or too conservative, then we have a real problem. Insufficiently conservative or insufficiently progressive would have been a better way to put that. Go and look at my presentation on party polarization in Congress. Congressional dysfunction, I've alluded to this already. Congress just doesn't work. Congress is a mosaic of competing vested interests, and the processes by which it operates are Byzantine in their complexity. They only work if you've got somebody who can pull it all together, who can compromise, who can coordinate, and who can encourage the various different players within that to cooperate. Now, committee chairs used to be able to do this. It was horrible. It was dirty deals done very, very expensively. But at least they were able to generate legislation at the end of the day. Yes, it was bloated. Yes, it was long. But hey, some legislation arguably is better than no legislation. Party chairs undermined the power of committee chairs with our Contract of America in '94 and onwards, assuming that they would be able to take over the show and run it like a British legislature, whereby they lined everybody up and sent them through. The problem is they can't do that. They don't have that level of leverage. They don't control election results the same way that parties in the UK control election results, and what's more, their powers of patronage are vastly diminished. So parties have not been able to demand the same level of cooperation, coordination and compromise that committee chairs could do. And the problem is, it's not that it's less corrupt. If you look at the omnibus bills and these omnibus spending bills, they're vast. They're more pork than they are legislation. And that's the only way they can get them through. So what you've got now is a situation whereby Congress can't really legislate, but the pork is still mounting up. So our intermediate conclusion based on all of this is that, does the Constitution adequately provide for contained government? It depends who you ask, and again, it depends what the question is. The expectations of government to deliver stuff have changed dramatically. And the government wants to do an awful lot of things, but it hasn't necessarily got the power to do that. And again, often we find ourselves taking recourse to gridlock and people asking SCOTUS to cut that Gordian knot. SCOTUS to offer clarity as to what the Constitution can and can't do. To what extent is Congress allowed to pass legislation that covers the entire country? To what extent is the President able to use his executive orders to bypass this logjam? And of course that leads to this simple accusation that they are imperial judiciary. We know that they're an imperial judiciary because they're outside the system of checks and balances, and we know that they're politicians in roads because they're political appointments that are asked political questions. So they're political appointments, they're asked political questions. Of course they're politicians in robes, and of course it's an imperial judiciary, but that's entirely by default. This wasn't their idea. They don't necessarily want it. It's just that they found themselves the grease in the wheel of the government machine. The only reason the Constitution hasn't imploded spectacularly is because of the judiciary. It's the judiciary who find the grey areas in the Constitution that allow it to lurch from one crisis to the next. It's the judges, who are able to stretch the Constitution to fit, to ensure that gay people are not discriminated against. It's only the judges who can turn around and say to the executive, no, you have to apply the Constitution in Guantanamo. So rightly or wrongly, and for better or worse, and they have made some almighty clying decisions, Shelby County being one that just leaps to mind, the dismantling of the bipartisan campaign finance reform act being another. SCOTUS has been getting it wrong, there's no doubt about that, but at the same time, it is only SCOTUS that has stopped the Constitution from grinding or bringing the American political system to an almighty standstill. We know that because primacy of the individual ends up in the Supreme Court. Primacy of the states winds up in the Supreme Court. Democracy, bit of a mess, not the Constitution's fault, and therefore slightly outside the control of the Supreme Court. Again, I'm glossing over Bush v. Gore 2000 because that's a one-off. Containing government, again, it always seems to wind up in the Supreme Court. Supreme Court, what can we do? How can we overcome the logjam? How can we get past the gridlock that the Constitution has created? So, the final conclusion has to be that the fact that the Constitution is still exact at this time is frankly nothing short of a miracle. If I was going into hospital, I would be very, very scared if the doctor was using a medical textbook from 240 years ago. If I was getting in a plane that was designed 240 years ago, I would A, be quite surprised, B, terrified. You know, the only thing really that came up 240 years ago that is still in constant use today, top of my head, Hume's inquiries and the American Constitution. This is an amazing piece of work, but it needs the Supreme Court to try to make sure that it fits, that it doesn't implode completely. And of course that shunts a huge amount of power onto the judiciary. They are politicians in disguise because they're political appointments being asked political questions. They're an imperial judiciary because no one can do anything to reverse one of their judgments short of amending the Constitution, and frankly, that's just not going to happen. But they're the only thing that keeps the show on the road, and I think that's an amazing thing. And I think this is an amazing topic, and I love looking at the Constitution, and as I say, I think this is the one area where we have a real intellectual puzzle that offers the ambitious and audacious students a real chance to shine. I've loved talking through this with you. I'm more than happy to address any questions you have. You can send them to me through YouTube. You can ping them to me at my email address. I'll put a link up. If you want to take this further, again, more than happy to send those requests to me. I wish you all incredibly good luck in the exam. I hope you've enjoyed looking at American politics. I hope you will continue to be interested in politics, because when people start not taking an interest in politics, that's when things go horribly wrong. I wish you all the very best. Thanks for watching. See you in due course.